Hello, this is Kenneth Brashears again, and I wanted to bring a follow-up or post a follow-up to the history of the text in the New Testament that I did, and eventually I'm going to be working on some of the particular issues that unfortunately I had to gloss over in that because I've mentioned before that there's so much information to get into that if you're going to condense it down, it's going to be pretty difficult. But one of the things I wanted to talk about was this issue of translation methodologies and what it is, again, what it is that we actually have, and why is this important? Because one of the issues that often comes up is there's confusion with what it is that we have. When you go to a Bible bookstore or you read commentaries or you listen to this preacher, you listen to that preacher, you glean information off of some theologian somewhere, and you see in our particular language, being English, you see all these Bible translations. You see them all over the place. Now, granted, I did go through and basically say that you essentially have, I don't have my other one in here, two texts that are being translated. Most of them done today are based off this text right here, the Nassau Island Greek text. That's a 28th edition. And I don't know what I did with it. I'll have to look for it, but this is actually the majority text that I had in that series. Now, the Textus Receptus, as I presented it, and the one from the late 1800s that I have laying around here somewhere, it is derived from what is called the majority text. Now, this is a majority text, or the Byzantine text, and there's no major translation of what this is. I think there's one or two out there, but not done by a major group or major a committee. There's not a committee produced translation by that has been put together for our language. But the closest one that many like to say is the New King James, just because, in my opinion, I think it's because they give the footnotes of the variant readings on each page of the New Testament. They give you the Nassau Island text, the TR is the body, the Nassau Island text and the majority text are in the footnotes. Anyways, now there has been quite a bit of confusion, and I'm about to drop everything, but there's been quite a bit of confusion I think many people express when you go into a Bible bookstore or you go to a church and you see a plethora of things being used. You're a brand new Christian and somebody's telling you, they're throwing these Bible translations at you left and right, or you just don't know. So what do I do? What do I get? What am I doing? Well, here's the deal. Number one, we see, I think the most confusing word in all of this is the word version, because when you think version, you think something that's a different kind or a type. You think, what version of Microsoft do you have? Do you have 7, 8.8, 8.1, or Windows, Windows 10? What do you have? Or what version of this software do you have? And it's completely, it ends up becoming a completely different thing. Well, this is not what this is. A version for a Bible is a translation. So really replace the word version and replace the word Bible, like NASB, replace that with translation, because that's what it is. The Bible was written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Koine Greek, Hellenistic Koine Greek. I'm not going to take the Constitution of the United States, translate it into Mandarin, and then say the Mandarin translation is the standard of the American Constitution. That wouldn't make sense. You would say, no, This is a translation of it. Much of the Latin works that have been translated into English, you don't take the English and make that the standard. You say, well, no, what did the Latin say? So number one, replace that word version and replace that word Bible with translation, because that's what it is. Without these underlying Greek texts, these translations don't exist, or they would look completely different. They would exist, but in a completely different form. So I've mentioned before that if you were to take the Neso-Allen text, the majority text, the TR as it stands today, or really any of the, you could probably label 30 different printed texts TR, Textus Receptus, if you wanted to. If you wanted to get really technical, and they all had variations between them, but you could take all three of those, and you will not have a different faith. You can take the most Alexandrian manuscript, and again, I've mentioned how misleading the naming of the text types can be, but you're not going to have a different faith, and I hope that I explained that well to you. But anyway, however, moving on, what do I do as far as Bible translation is concerned? Because this is a big issue. In English, you could Google and they'll say there's 450 English translations of the Bible, and that's dependent upon what you want to call a translation. But once in the modern era, once you had the NASB, once you had the NIV and the New King James, and of course the English Revised of 1885, the ASV of 1901, which they're basically irrelevant now because now we've got papyri and much different understanding, and considering the Neso-Allen text became the most widely used text, and Westcott and Hort is basically irrelevant or outdated. But once you had some of the, once you've had the major translations, all of a sudden there's just this massive explosion of English translations. Just translations coming out left and right, and I think American capitalism is partly to blame for that, although it can be a good thing too. However, it can obviously be a very bad thing. Why? Because every publishing house doesn't want to pay royalties to Thomas Nelson for the New King James, or to Zondervan for NIV, or Lockman for NAS. They don't want to have to do that, so they come out with their own, or Crossway for ESV. They don't want to have to do that, so they come out with their own Bible translation. And the vast majority of them, I really don't see a need for. We have a plethora of translations. Now, that being said, I think there are translations that people can choose to use, even if I have particular issues with it, like the NIV. I have particular issues with how the translation methodology of the NIV was implemented. Now, I'll get into translation methodology here in a second. I have some various issues with how they did things. However, if I was limited to that, I believe that it is more than faithful enough that not only could I lead someone to Christ, but I could even disciple them. And a lot of that is because I like to go back to the original language of the text. And I think if you're going to be a student, I don't think every Christian needs to be a scholar, but if you're going to be a student, you need to work towards that. If you can learn Koine Greek, I think you should. I'm in the middle of doing some of the language work on my own before I get into Bible college. I have a day job, and so you have a family, and you have young kids, and you have a somewhat rigorous day job. It can make extra studying, especially college, a little difficult. However, the Lord is blessed, and I've finished my associate's degree, and I'm getting that. I've finished it, and I'm about to move on to the next step. Anyhow, back to this. how is translation done? How is translation work done? Well, translation work, you're basically going to hear these two terms. You're going to hear formal equivalents or literal equivalents, or word for word. You're going to hear something like that, and then you're going to hear dynamic equivalents or functional equivalents or paraphrase. The main difference between these is a word for word translation, King James, NASB, so on. They are trying to stick with the language being translated. They're trying to stick with it as best they can as far as the words go. A purely word for word translation, if you had 17 words in the original language, you had to have 17 words in the language being translated. Now that's actually impossible. The very, 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 very vast majority of the time, that's actually impossible. Even between English and Spanish, where we have a lot of words that we have, excuse me, a lot of words that we share and we get from each other, you can't do a complete word for word from Spanish to English or English to Spanish. That's actually it's not possible, and that's because of particularities of the language. And that's the same thing from Greek really to any other language. Now a paraphrase. Now I need to distinguish between functional equivalents or dynamic equivalents and paraphrase. A paraphrase is somebody looking at the text and basically saying, I believe this says this. I think this is what is trying to be conveyed. They are very loose with the text. And of course we hear, let me paraphrase what I was saying. Yeah, and we dumb it down a little bit to try to make sense of it. Now, functional equivalents, they are basically willing to change words from that would have been present in the original to convey the meaning. And oftentimes that's actually necessary. Every translation uses an element of functional equivalence or dynamic equivalence. Give you a good example. I believe it's Matthew 1:18, where Mary was found to be with child or pregnant. The literal Greek words are she was found to be having it in the belly. And that's not how you would translate it in English in America today. And let me think here. I'll give you another example of where, well, I'll give you an example. This is one of my criticisms of the NIV. So in, I believe it's 1 Corinthians 9:27. Let me get here. So 1 Corinthians 9:27, the King James will render it, I keep under my body. Most of your translations today will say, I discipline my body and make it my slave, or I subject my body. The NIV, ironically, which prides itself on trying to be functional, says, I beat my body. Now, the Greek word hupopiazo literally means to beat yourself. That's what the word literally means. However, if you look at the context and what Paul is trying to say, you say, well, I discipline my body. Now, that would technically be a functional equivalent, but I would like to say it's proper equivalent or optimal equivalent, because you're being true to the word, but you're also taking a little liberty there to say, well, we need to convey the meaning here. And there are a plethora of examples that we could go to, but to move on. So when you're trying to decide what it is that you should use, so you ask yourself, what should I use? Well, here's the thing, and this is my issue with the majority of translation. Yes, you can use virtually any, not really all of these in my opinion. Like I said, I would never use a paraphrase because, number one, the majority of them are done by one person, and I would never use a one-person translation. I'll give you an example. There are times where I reference Young's literal translation. Now, it is a very old translation, late 1800s. It's very literal, and and it was only done by one person. You have too many, there's too much risk of the particularities of the translator being portrayed in the translation, because there is an element that you rely upon the translator. However, the more word for word you go, then the less you're putting on the translator to I lost the word, my goodness. Basically, you're not relying as much upon the translator to get the meaning. The more word for word you're trying to say, a formal equivalent translation is trying to limit how much freedom can be taken with the text. But I notice that there are some people who just can't read worth a lick. And here's the thing: we have children's Bibles. We for my girls and my little boy, he's going to get one too, but they have their own little children's Bible that it'll give scripture references, but you're trying to teach them to read, and you're giving them the gist of the gospel and all the Bible stories and whatnot. So we have those, and then you also have people who may not have a translation in their language, and then English is a second language, and so what do we do with that person? And then you have people who just can't read worth a lick anyways, which happens to be probably most of the most of the American population. Now, or you have some people who legitimately struggle. So I have an old friend from around Fort Campbell, Kentucky. He actually started using the NLT. And it is a dynamic equivalent translation. It has its flaws in translation methodology or in how it's been applied, but he grew from it, and it helped him. Now, I think the overall goal, this is my take on it, the overall goal is to move, if you have to start with something that's more towards dynamic and paraphrase, is to, as best you can, quote unquote, graduate from here over on the right by the dynamic translations and paraphrases, and eventually make your way over towards the left over here towards the more formal equivalent and word for word. Now, here's another thing, and some people will disagree with this, but I think I can make a really good case as to why you do this. Some people ask, well, what do I use? What do I use? Well, I'll tell you. I use more than one. I use the first Bible I ever used was a New King James, because that's what we had in the house. When I got saved when I was about 9 years old, and it was through my grandmother. God used my grandmother when I was with her to take me to church, and that's where I heard the gospel and laid precious faith upon Jesus that the afternoon after I'd heard the gospel that Sunday morning. And I said, I wasn't put in church as a child, but I came to the conclusion, I'm like, I'm a Christian, I should probably be reading the Bible, because that's what Christians do, right? So I asked my mom. I actually was using my mom's Bible. It was a New King James, and I wore that thing out. I eventually said, I don't care how much I read, as long as I read a little bit, even just a little bit each day. But eventually got to the point where I wore that Bible out. I was given a King James Bible from the church, and I eventually started going to when I was 17, and used that. And I used my Ryrie study Bible for a long time. I got that one myself, and I just loved the notes, loved the studying around the language. And eventually, so you may ask, what do I use now? Well, I use at least three. Now, I have one that I use for normal reading, and that's actually a New King James. But I will use King James, New King James, and right now NAS. And when I'm on my computer, I reference ESV because I have that for free on eSword. and even then, though, I like to go to Greek. When I'm in the New Testament, because I'm also trying to study the language a little bit, I want to go to, what does the Greek say? Because here's something that I think we all need to learn. Words don't have meaning. They have application. I'll say it again. Words don't have meaning. They have application. What do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you an example. In 1611 and 1 Corinthians 10, I think it's 10:25, Paul writes to them, whatever is sold in the shambles, your 1611. I think the Geneva Bible may have it that way. I'm not sure. Well, shambles in 1611 meant meat market, and it was a very suitable word. But shambles today, I would say my office is in shambles, or my bedroom is in shambles, or my life is in shambles, has nothing to do with meat. So again, the word has an application. I'll give you another example. This was weird. I stumbled across this while I was looking up material for the previous video I did about the Romans 1 issue and the NIFB misunderstanding of that and whatnot. Well, when I went to 1 Kings 14:24, where the King James translated Kadesh as sodomite, for some reason I have a copy of the Septuagint. And I went to it and I was like, whoa, I wonder what it says. And I looked at the words and I thought, that looks odd. The words syndesmos was the word I saw, and it was syndesmos genomi, or genomi. And I thought, that just seems weird. Basically, some type of binding conspiracy is in the land. What in the world does that mean? Now, granted, the Septuagint was translated from it was Hebrew into Greek around, I can't remember if it was the 3rd century BC. However, going on, I go to my brother-in-law, I said, what in the world is this? He's got his master's degree now from, I believe, Southwest Theological Seminary, and I said, what in the world is this? I found this do these words, did they have that application then? Well, he reminded me that I believe in Ephesians and Colossians, the word syndesmos is talking about, syndesmos is that something that ties together, that binds together, it's that binding love of Jesus, of God and whatnot. Well, anyways, when those Jewish rabbis sat down and they translated this, from Hebrew into Greek, and they got to that point to, there were sodomites in the land, or there were temple prostitutes in the land, and you go back to Canaanite idolatrous practices, especially their sexual deviancies within the temple, and then you go to how those words were used, this binding conspiracy type thing, and conspiracy gives a negative context, and again, how that word was applied in that day, I thought, I was like, that is so odd, because it was confusing for me to read an English translation of the Septuagint. An English translation of the Septuagint, and even looking at the Greek with it, I was like, that makes no sense to me. But again, that's because we have a different application for those words today. Normally, when you hear the word conspiracy, like conspiracy theory, or they conspired to do this, we don't apply that necessarily to Canaanite sexual idolatrous deviancies. And so again, words have application, they don't have meaning. I think words having application makes more sense. But I'll give you another reason why I'll use more than one. Because again, they're translations. They are not Bible versions. They are not different Bibles. They are translations. So when I'm in, say, Romans 9:5, I'll use Romans 9:5 as an example. Your NAS, your King James, both being literal, will say, whose are the fathers, from whom is the Christ according to the flesh, who is over all, God blessed forever. Amen. Who is over all, comma, God blessed forever. Amen. Now your New King James for Romans 9:5 says, of whom are the fathers, and from whom according to the flesh, comma, Christ came, comma, who is over all, comma, the eternally blessed God. Amen. So one is kind of muddled and says Jesus is God blessed forever, and then the other reveals the intent as to saying Jesus is the eternally blessed God. So the New King James translators went a tad bit dynamic because they said Paul, because of the way it is and the context and what Paul is saying, he's calling Jesus God here. Very interesting. And the more you get into the Greek language, the more you can look stuff like that up. Anyhow, what may be rendered one way by one committee of translators may seem odd to you and may kind of muddle, because there are times when I read the King James and it makes more sense in that particular passage than some of the modern ones do. And I was like, very interesting. And so again, I would say don't limit yourself to one, number one. Again, I would say move over towards the left side of this spectrum here, because if you're, I would say graduate up to that. If you're a child learning to read and you're struggling, I understand the use of dynamic translations. Actually, I've seen the NRSV used. The New American Bible, I think that's actually the Catholic, the newer Catholic Bible after the Douay Rheims. Probably wouldn't read that one, but or use it, I should say. I've seen the Common English Bible used by folks desiring a more dynamic equivalent, or at least used alongside a formal equivalent one. However, don't limit yourself to one. And if you are able to read to get to the original language, to get into Greek and get into the history behind everything, I think that would be fantastic, because then you're not reliant upon one translation. Now, granted, most people that I'm around, we want one translation. We want one thing, one edited edition, and say, here it is, this is the standard and be all and end all of all things. But number one, if you realize how God gave us his word, because again, I'm going to say this again, words don't have meaning, they have application. Is the translation being faithful to the message that God has brought? Because some say, well, what about the legitimate words? Well, if we did that, then there are many words, because it was inspired or breathed out in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, that you would not be able to translate into English. So if we went off that standard, then we wouldn't have a lot of those words. His words would literally, all of them would be literally be limited to those languages. At the same time, you have to understand, when you're translating from one language to another, you have to take liberty, because this is, you just have to, because constructs and rules of grammar, and then even as the languages changed over the centuries and they developed, you look at a 10th century minuscule of the Byzantine text, and then you look at a 3rd century uncial or papyri that is of the Alexandrian text, you're going to have a completely different script, and you're probably going to have differences in applications of words, because we look at how English has changed over the 1,000 years that English has been around. And we don't even use words. We still use some words today that 400 years ago meant something completely different. 400 years ago, let meant to restrain. Today, let means to allow. And so prevent meant to precede in that day. Now prevent today means to restrict or to restrain. So again, don't get caught up in that necessarily, because again, you can't go 100% word for word. It's absolutely impossible for probably all languages going into any other language. So anyways, if there are any questions that anyone has, put them in the comments, send me a message, whatever. I would be glad to discuss anything else anybody might have. I just figured I would try to get into that topic a little bit, because I don't know if I was able to get, I don't really think I was able to get very far with the New Testament history video. So anyways, hit like, subscribe, again, comment. I try to steer away from absolute arguments, as I don't think they are productive. So if you're looking for an argument, I'm not it. I will be glad to discuss. Even if we have a stark disagreement, I would be glad to discuss, because you have the proverb that iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. Well, you got to think about it. In order for iron to be sharpened, what do you have to do to it? You got to make uncomfortable, hard, harsh contact. And sometimes there are issues like this that may cause some uncomfortable, harsh, hard contact. So I'd be glad to answer any questions, and you all have a blessed day. Thank you.